I thought burying my mother was the worst day of my life. I was wrong. The worst day was when I came home and found her sitting in our living room, very much alive, with a suitcase full of medical files that would change everything I thought I knew about her. What I discovered in those files didn't just bring my mother back from the dead, it revealed she'd been living a double life that put both our lives in immediate danger. My name is Isla Thorne, and at 28, I never imagined I'd spend my morning throwing dirt on my mother's coffin, and my evening discovering she'd been conducting illegal medical experiments. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments, because this story involves people from all over the country, and you might be surprised by the connections. And if this opening already has you questioning everything, hit that like button because trust me, we're just getting started. The funeral home smelled like artificial lilies and industrial disinfectant, a combination that made my empty stomach churn even more than it already was. I sat in the front row of folding chairs, staring at the mahogany casket draped with white roses that cost more than I made in a week at my marketing job, trying to process how my world had collapsed in just 72 hours. Felt like attempting to solve a puzzle while drowning. 3 days ago, Vera Thorne had been complaining about her lower back pain from long shifts at Riverside General Hospital, same as she had every Sunday when we talked on the phone. 2 days ago, she was dead from what Dr. Marcus Webb called sudden cardiac complications with underlying metabolic factors, medical jargon that meant absolutely nothing to me except that my mother's heart had simply stopped working. Today, I was accepting condolences from people who barely knew her, wondering how someone so full of life could just vanish. The service felt hollow, rushed in a way that made me uncomfortable. Only 37 people showed up, which seemed impossibly small for someone who'd worked at the same hospital for 15 years and lived in this town her entire life. I kept expecting more of her colleagues to arrive. More neighbors, more friends from the book club she'd mentioned attending, but the sparse gathering never grew beyond this small collection of acquaintances and distant relatives. Aunt Delilah sat beside me like a disapproving hawk, occasionally patting my knee with her cold, bony fingers while shooting critical glances at my black dress. Vera would have wanted something more traditional, she'd whispered earlier, eyeing the simple sheath dress I'd grabbed from my closet at 6 a.m. Something with sleeves, perhaps more modest. As if modesty mattered when your mother dies at 52, without any warning whatsoever. Dr. Marcus Webb stepped up to the podium, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with hands that seemed to tremble slightly. I'd met him twice before at hospital Christmas parties, where he'd struck me as competent but unremarkable. Today, something about his demeanor felt different, strained. Vera was extraordinarily dedicated to her patients, he began, his voice carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. She worked tirelessly in our laboratory, always pushing boundaries in her research, always looking for new ways to help people who had exhausted traditional options. He paused, his eyes finding mine across the room and lingering longer than felt comfortable or appropriate. She was working on something very special before she passed. Something that could have helped many people, changed many lives. The phrase could have helped struck me as odd, not would help or was helping, but could have, as if whatever she'd been working on had died with her, leaving behind only possibilities and regrets. Mrs. Patterson from next door followed Dr. Webb to the podium, sharing stories about Mom's garden and her kindness to elderly neighbors. Normal memories that felt completely disconnected from the clinical, research-focused description we'd just heard. 2 different versions of the same woman, and I was starting to realize I might not have known either of them as well as I'd thought. The service concluded with a hymn I didn't recognize, something about eternal rest and peaceful sleep that felt foreign to my secular upbringing, as people filed past the casket to pay their respects. I noticed something that had been bothering me all morning without me being able to identify exactly what it was. The casket remained sealed throughout the entire ceremony, which seemed unusual for what was supposed to be a celebration of someone's life. When I'd asked about viewing arrangements the day before, the funeral director, Mr. Henley, had given vague explanations about the condition of the body and family preferences, but I hadn't expressed any such preference. "It's better this way, honey," Aunt Delilah had said when I questioned it. But better for whom? Better for people who wanted to remember Mom as she was, or better for someone who didn't want us to see what she actually looked like. Standing alone beside the casket as the crowd began to disperse, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Chen, Mom's closest friend from the hospital cafeteria, squeezed gently. She was a small woman with kind eyes who had always remembered my birthday and asked about my job whenever I visited Mom at work. "Isla, honey, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "Your mother talked about you constantly. She was so proud of how independent you'd become, how successful you were in the city." Then Mrs. Chen glanced around nervously, making sure no one else was within earshot, before lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "She wanted you to have this," she said, pressing a small brass key into my palm. About a week before she passed, she pulled me aside and said it was important. Said you'd understand when the time came, that you'd know what to do with it. The key was warm from her hand and felt heavier than it should have, with an intricate pattern etched into its surface that looked both old and expensive. I'd never seen it before, but something about its weight and craftsmanship suggested it unlocked something far more significant than a jewelry box or desk drawer. "What's it for?" I asked, but Mrs. Chen was already backing away, her expression suddenly fearful. "I don't know, dear. I promised I'd give it to you, that's all. That's what friends do." She hurried toward the parking lot before I could ask anything else, leaving me holding a mystery that felt like another weight added to an already unbearable day. As I watched her practically flee to her car, I wondered what had frightened her so badly that she couldn't wait to escape. The drive home took 40 minutes through winding country roads that led to our neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Mom's house sat at the end of Maple Crest Drive, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters she'd painted herself the summer before last. The garden she'd tended so carefully was still immaculate, bursting with late-season roses and perfectly trimmed hedges, which struck me as strange. Who had been maintaining this level of care during the chaos of the past 3 days? The mailbox overflowed with sympathy cards and what looked like medical correspondence that I'd need to sort through eventually. Bills from the hospital, insurance documents, letters from pharmaceutical companies, the kind of administrative nightmare that follows death like scavengers after a meal. I sat in my car for several minutes, dreading the emptiness waiting inside. The silence that would confirm she was really gone. The house had been our sanctuary when Dad left 12 years ago. The place where Mom and I had rebuilt our lives together after his abandonment shattered our family. She'd painted every room herself, planted the garden from scratch, turned it into something beautiful and entirely ours. Now it felt like approaching a tomb holding memories I wasn't ready to face. But something was fundamentally wrong with that picture. Light glowed from the living room windows, warm and inviting against the approaching dusk. Not just one lamp left on by accident, but multiple lights creating the kind of lived-in atmosphere that suggested someone was home, waiting, comfortable. I was absolutely certain I'd turned everything off before leaving for the funeral that morning, checking twice because Mom had always been obsessive about electricity bills. My hands trembled as I unlocked the front door, telling myself I'd simply forgotten about automatic timers or that helpful neighbors had stopped by to make the house look occupied. The lock turned smoothly, exactly as it always had, but when I stepped inside, every rationalization crumbled. The house smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, Mom's signature candles that she burned while reading her medical journals in the evening. But underneath those familiar scents was something else, the rich, unmistakable aroma of coffee, freshly brewed and still warm. Classical music drifted from the living room. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the specific piece Mom always played when she was deep in concentration, working on something that required her complete attention. She used to say that Beethoven helped her think more clearly, that the mathematical precision of his compositions somehow organized her thoughts when she was solving complex problems. Hearing it now felt like being haunted by the ghost of her routines. My rational mind scrambled desperately for explanations. A timer system I didn't know about. Neighbors who had keys and were trying to be helpful. A radio left on that had coincidentally started playing her favorite music. Anything except the impossible truth my heart was already accepting with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Then I heard her voice, clear and unmistakable, humming along with the symphony from the living room. Not a memory or a hallucination, but the actual sound of my mother's voice, slightly off-key as it always was when she thought no one was listening. The sound hit me like ice water, stopping my breath entirely and making my vision blur around the edges. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there in the entryway while my entire understanding of reality crumbled. Footsteps approached from the direction of her favorite reading chair, the one positioned perfectly to catch afternoon light from the west-facing window. Light. Familiar steps in the house slippers she'd worn for as long as I could remember. I knew the sound of her walk better than my own heartbeat, and there was no mistaking it for anyone else. "Hello, sweetheart," Mom said, appearing in the doorway between the hall and living room, as if the last 3 days had been nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. She looked exactly as she always had, graying brown hair pulled back in her usual messy bun, reading glasses perched on her nose, wearing the navy cardigan I'd given her for her birthday 2 years ago. In her hands was a medical journal, folded open to an article about experimental cancer treatments. "I know this is shocking, but we need to talk." My legs gave out completely. I collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, staring at her while my mind reeled through possibilities and found absolutely nothing that made sense. She looked solid, real, completely alive, not pale or ethereal like the ghosts in movies, but perfectly, impossibly normal. The same small scar on her chin from a childhood bicycle accident. The same laugh lines around her green eyes. The same slight tremor in her left hand that had developed over the past year. "Mom." The word came out as barely a whisper, my voice cracking like a teenager's. "I'm here," she said gently, setting down the journal on the hall table and moving toward me with her arms extended in the same gesture of comfort she'd used when I was small and frightened. "I'm real, and I'm alive. And I know you have 1,000 questions that need answers." When I instinctively flinched backward, pressing myself against the stair banister, she stopped moving, her expression filling with understanding and something that looked remarkably like guilt. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she continued, her voice taking on the serious tone she'd used when explaining difficult concepts during my teenage years. "Everything that happened, the hospital, the funeral, all of it was necessary to protect you, to protect both of us, actually, but mostly you." "Protect me from what?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hollow and distant. You're supposed to be dead. I watched them lower your casket into the ground 6 hours ago. I threw dirt on it. I wrote your obituary." She moved to the coffee table and gestured toward a black medical case sitting there, the kind doctors use to transport sensitive equipment or confidential patient files. It was large enough to hold dozens of folders and looked expensive, professional. Nothing like the personal items I'd expected to find in her living room. "From what's in that case?" she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made my stomach clench with dread. "From people who would hurt you to get to me. From the truth about what I've been doing at the hospital for the past 2 years." I stared at the case, noting how its matte black surface seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Everything about it looked official, important, and completely out of place in our cozy living room with its floral wallpaper and family photos. "What kind of truth?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Part of me wanted to wake up in my apartment in the city and discover this entire day had been an elaborate stress-induced hallucination, instead of answering directly. Mom opened the case with careful, practiced movements, as if she'd done this many times before. Inside were manila folders, each labeled with a name and patient number in neat, clinical handwriting, even from several feet away. I could see they were medical files, the kind that should have been secured in hospital databases rather than sitting in my mother's living room like casual reading material. "These are patient records," she said, her voice barely audible now. "People from our town and surrounding areas who came to me for help when traditional medicine failed them, when their insurance companies abandoned them, when their doctors told them there was nothing left to try." She lifted the first folder with reverent care, and I recognized the name immediately, Robert Martinez, the elderly man who owned the hardware store downtown. He'd been a fixture in our community for decades, always ready with advice about home repairs and stories about the town's history. He'd died 2 months ago from pancreatic cancer, and the whole town had attended his funeral. I remembered how quickly he'd declined, how his family had seemed simultaneously devastated and relieved that his suffering was over. "Mr. Martinez came to me because his insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment his oncologist recommended," Mom continued, opening the folder to reveal detailed treatment protocols and progress notes. "The therapy cost $80,000, money his family didn't have. His daughter was ready to mortgage her house, sell everything they owned, but I was able to get him into a compassionate use program that showed real promise." My heart began to pound as she showed me more files, each one containing a name I knew, a face I'd seen around town my entire life. Sarah Williams, who'd taught Sunday school at the community center until her breast cancer returned. David Park, the young father who'd coached Little League before his leukemia diagnosis. Margaret Thompson, no relation but someone I'd known since childhood, who'd fought brain cancer with every resource available. All people who had died in the past 2 years, all from terminal illnesses, all after receiving what Mom called experimental treatments through her mysterious program. The pattern was becoming clear, and it made my skin crawl with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. "I don't understand," I said, my voice gaining strength as my shock began transforming into something more analytical. "Are you saying you were treating these people outside the hospital, running some kind of unauthorized medical program?" "I'm saying I was trying to save them when no one else would even try," she replied, and there was a defensive edge to her voice that I'd never heard before. "Do you have any idea how many people die in this country simply because they can't afford the treatments that might help them? How many give up hope because insurance companies decide their lives aren't worth the cost of experimental medicine?" She set down another folder, this one bearing the name of Emma's grandfather, a man I'd known since childhood who'd been like a surrogate grandfather to me as well. "I gave them hope. Isla," I gave them a chance to fight when everyone else had written them off as terminal cases. I gave their families the knowledge that they'd tried everything possible. But something in her explanation felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced these justifications in front of a mirror. The words came too smoothly, too perfectly crafted to address exactly the moral objections someone might raise. "Mom, these people are all dead," I pointed out, my voice growing stronger as my analytical mind began to override my emotional shock. If you were helping them, if these treatments were so promising, why didn't any of them survive? Not even one. The question hung in the air between us, like a physical presence, and I watched her face carefully as she processed it. For just a moment, her confident expression faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like panic before she regained control. "Not everyone can be saved," she said finally, but her voice lacked the conviction of her earlier statements. "Cancer is a terrible disease, and even the most advanced treatments fail sometimes, but at least they had hope in their final weeks. At least their families knew we'd tried everything possible." I picked up one of the folders, noting how pristine everything looked despite supposedly containing records of months-long experimental treatments. Inside were photocopied medical documents, insurance forms, and treatment protocols that looked far more sophisticated than anything I'd expect from a small-town hospital program. The paperwork was extensive, professional, and completely unfamiliar despite my mother having worked at Riverside General for 15 years. "Where did these treatments come from?" I asked, flipping through pages of medical terminology I couldn't understand. "Who was funding this program? How are you getting access to experimental drugs that aren't available through normal channels?" "Dr. Sebastian Cross was the supervising physician," she said, and something in her tone when she spoke his name made me look up sharply. There was a familiarity there, an intimacy that suggested their relationship went beyond simple professional collaboration. "He's a brilliant researcher who's been developing new approaches to terminal illnesses. The treatments aren't officially approved yet, but for patients with no other options," she trailed off. But her eyes were watching my reaction carefully, as if gauging how much truth I could handle at once. I'd never heard Mom mention Dr. Cross before, which seemed extremely strange if they'd been working together on something this significant for 2 years, in a town this size. Medical professionals knew each other, talked about each other, especially when revolutionary research was involved. "Is he at Riverside General?" I asked. "I've never met him, never heard anyone mention him. How long have you been working together?" "He works with multiple facilities," she said vaguely, moving to close the medical case as if the conversation was over. "Research is his primary focus, not regular patient care. He travels extensively, consults with hospitals across the region." Her desire to end this line of questioning was obvious, but I was far from satisfied with her evasive answers. That's when I noticed something else in the case, a folder that looked different from the patient records. Instead of a person's name, it was labeled "Financial Records" in Mom's careful handwriting. The same script she'd used for grocery lists and birthday cards my entire life. Before she could stop me, I grabbed it and opened it to find bank statements and payment records that made my blood run cold. Deposits of $100,000 made monthly for the past 2 years. All from something called Cross Medical Consulting. The amounts were staggering more money than our family had ever possessed. Enough to explain how Mom had been able to renovate the kitchen last year, buy a new car, and take that expensive vacation to Europe she'd claimed was a hospital staff reward trip. "Mom," I said slowly, holding up one of the bank statements with hands that had started shaking again. "These people were paying you. Their families were giving you money for these experimental treatments." The implications crashed over me like a cold wave, washing away any remaining hope that this situation had an innocent explanation. She snatched the folder from my hands with more force than necessary, But it was too late. I'd seen enough to understand that whatever she'd been doing, it had nothing to do with charity work or compassionate medicine. "It's not what you think," she said quickly, but her voice carried the tone of someone whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to crumble. "The families wanted to contribute to the research. They knew the treatments were experimental, but they also knew it was their only chance. They were grateful for the opportunity." $100,000. Mom? From people who were desperate enough to try anything? I stood up, backing away from her as the full scope of what I was seeing began to sink in. These people mortgaged their homes, emptied their retirement accounts, borrowed against their children's futures. And you took their money knowing the treatments probably wouldn't work. "We didn't know they wouldn't work," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction, and I could see the carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. Every case was different. Every patient had legitimate hope for recovery based on their specific condition and the treatment protocols we developed. She moved toward me, reaching out as if to comfort me, but I stepped further back, suddenly afraid of the woman who had raised me. "Isla, you have to understand, the medical system in this country is fundamentally broken. Insurance companies let people die rather than pay for treatments that might save them. We were giving people options they wouldn't have had otherwise. Hope they couldn't find anywhere else." But even as she spoke, I could see doubt creeping into her own expression, as if hearing her justifications out loud was forcing her to confront their emptiness. I was remembering other things now. Details that had seemed unimportant at the time, but were taking on sinister new meanings. Mr. Martinez's daughter had mentioned how quickly her father had declined after starting his new treatment, how the side effects seemed worse than the cancer itself. Sarah Williams' husband had seemed confused about the costs when I'd offered condolences at the grocery store, mentioning something about unexpected expenses that had drained their savings. "They trusted you," I said, my voice growing stronger with righteous anger. "These people trusted you because you were a medical professional, because they thought you had access to cutting-edge treatments that could save their lives. And you took advantage of their desperation, their love for their dying family members, their willingness to sacrifice everything for hope. I was trying to help them." The desperation in her voice was unmistakable now, raw and genuine in a way that suggested she might have started with good intentions, even if those intentions had been corrupted somewhere along the way. "You don't understand how it feels to watch people die because they can't afford treatment. I found a way to give them hope, to let them feel like they were fighting instead of just waiting to die. By lying to them about their chances." I picked up another folder, this one containing what looked like fabricated test results showing miraculous improvements that clearly hadn't actually occurred. By taking their life savings and giving them false hope while their real condition deteriorated, the word false seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She sank into her reading chair, suddenly looking far older than her 52 years, as if the weight of her actions was finally becoming real to her. "It's more complicated than that," she whispered, but there was no conviction left in her voice. "You don't know the whole story. You don't understand what Dr. Cross promised, what the research was supposed to accomplish." That's when my phone rang, the sound sharp and urgent in the tense atmosphere. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but Mom's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Her face went completely white, and she lunged toward me with desperate urgency. "Don't answer that," she said, her voice carrying a level of fear I'd never heard from her before. "Whatever you do, Isla, do not answer that phone." But I was tired of not understanding, tired of being protected from truths I clearly needed to know, tired of discovering that everything I thought I knew about my mother was a carefully constructed lie. I answered the call before she could stop me, bringing the phone to my ear with a sense of defiant determination. Hello? Miss Thorne. The voice was smooth, professional, with the kind of practiced authority that comes from years of being obeyed without question. This is Dr. Sebastian Cross. I believe your mother has something that belongs to me. I looked at Mom, who was shaking her head frantically while making slashing motions across her throat. I'm sorry. Who is this? I said, though something about his voice made my skin crawl. I'm the doctor who's been working with your mother on her research project, Dr. Cross said, and there was something predatory in his tone that made every instinct scream danger. I understand this must be a difficult time for you, but it's very important that I speak with Vera immediately. There are some loose ends that need to be addressed before her death becomes public knowledge. The phrase "before her death becomes public knowledge" hit me like ice water. Her death is already public knowledge, I said slowly, watching Mom's face grow increasingly pale. We buried her today. Half the town was there. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Dr. Cross spoke again, his voice had lost its professional veneer entirely. Miss Thorne, I think we need to have a conversation. I'll be at your house in 20 minutes, and I strongly suggest that your mother makes herself available for that conversation. We have business to conclude. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone while Mom sat in her chair looking like she was about to be sick. Who is he really? I asked, though I was starting to suspect the answer would be worse than anything I'd imagined so far. He's the reason I had to die, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. And now that he knows I'm alive, he's coming to finish what he started. She stood up abruptly, moving with sudden purpose toward the basement door. We need to get downstairs, now. There are things you need to see before he arrives. I followed her down the narrow wooden steps, noting how she moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this trip many times recently. The basement had been renovated since my last visit, transformed from a typical suburban storage space into something that looked almost professional. Computer equipment lined one wall, filing cabinets filled another, and in the center of the room sat a massive safe I'd never seen before. Mom, what is all this? I asked, gesturing at the sophisticated setup that had clearly cost more money than a hospital lab technician should possess. This is where I kept the real records, she said, entering a complex code into the safe's digital lock. The files upstairs were just the tip of the iceberg. What Dr. Cross doesn't know is that I documented everything, every conversation, every payment, every lie we told those families. The safe opened to reveal stacks of documents, flash drives, and what looked like recording equipment. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Cross Medical Consulting, Complete Records, and spread its contents across a nearby table. What I saw made my stomach drop. Financial records showing payments not just to Mom, but to dozens of other medical professionals across 3 states. Treatment protocols that weren't experimental medicine at all, but elaborate placebos designed to give families false hope while extracting maximum payment. We weren't trying experimental treatments, she said, her voice flat with resigned honesty. We were selling hope to desperate people, convincing them to pay enormous sums for sugar pills and saline injections while their loved ones died exactly as they would have without any intervention. She pointed to a spreadsheet showing profits of over $12 million across 2 years. Dr. Cross convinced me we were doing compassionate work, but it was just an elaborate fraud. I stared at the evidence, feeling sick as the full scope of the operation became clear. How many people? I asked. 437 patients across the network, she whispered. All terminal, all desperate, all convinced they were receiving cutting-edge treatments that might save their lives. She pulled out photographs of families, testimonials written by grateful relatives who believed their loved ones had received the best possible care in their final months. But why fake your death? Why not just disappear? Leave town. Mom's expression darkened. Because I started having second thoughts. I wanted out, wanted to expose what we were doing. When Dr. Cross realized I was becoming a liability, he decided to eliminate the problem permanently. She showed me a series of threatening text messages, increasingly violent in tone. The heart attack was supposed to be real. He has connections at the hospital, people who could make it look natural. Then how are you alive? The pieces still weren't fitting together in my mind. Dr. Patricia Vance in the ER is an old friend from medical school. When I collapsed at work, she recognized the symptoms of poisoning, not heart failure. She managed to counteract whatever Cross had given me, but she told everyone I'd died to give us time to figure out what to do next. Mom pulled out medical records showing the real cause of her collapse, a powerful drug that mimics cardiac arrest. So the funeral was a complete fabrication, empty casket, falsified death certificate, everything staged to convince Cross that his problem was solved. She looked at me with desperate eyes. But Patricia could only buy us a few days. Cross has been suspicious, asking questions, demanding to see the body. When you answered that phone, you confirmed his worst fears. The sound of car doors slamming outside made us both freeze. Through the small basement window, I could see a black sedan parked in our driveway and two figures in dark suits walking toward the front door. Dr. Cross had arrived early, and he wasn't alone. "There's a tunnel," Mom whispered urgently, pointing to what looked like a storage closet in the corner of the basement. "It connects to the Johnsons' garage next door. Patricia helped me install it last week in case something like this happened." She began gathering the most incriminating evidence, shoving files and flash drives into a waterproof bag. "What about you?" I asked, but she was already pushing me toward the hidden exit. "I'm going to face him," she said with a resignation that terrified me. "This is my mess, my responsibility. You take that evidence and get it to the FBI. Tell them everything." She handed me a business card for Agent Patricia Chen, clearly someone she'd already contacted. "She's expecting your call." The doorbell rang upstairs, followed immediately by heavy knocking. Dr. Cross wasn't bothering with pleasantries. "Vera," his voice called through the door. "I know you're in there. Let's discuss this like rational adults." "Mom, I'm not leaving you," I whispered, but she was already opening the hidden panel. "You have to. Those families deserve justice, and you're the only one who can make sure they get it." She kissed my forehead quickly. "I love you, sweetheart. Now go, before it's too late." I crawled through the narrow tunnel, dragging the evidence bag behind me, while the sounds of forced entry echoed from the house behind me. By the time I emerged in the Johnsons' garage, I could hear shouting from our living room. Dr. Cross had found Mom, and he wasn't happy about her resurrection. I called Agent Chen from my car as I drove toward the FBI field office, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "Agent Chen, this is Isla Thorne. My mother said you were expecting my call." The conversation was brief but efficient. She'd been investigating Cross Medical Consulting for months, waiting for someone with inside knowledge to come forward. The raid on Dr. Cross's operation happened within hours. Mom's evidence led to arrests across 3 states, shutting down the entire network and recovering millions in stolen funds for victim families. Dr. Cross himself was found at our house, still trying to extract information from Mom about additional evidence caches. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching Dr. Sebastian Cross receive a 25-year sentence for medical fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Mom testified against him, her plea agreement resulting in 5 years in minimum security prison and full restitution to victim families. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was accountability. The hardest part was facing the families we'd helped deceive. Some forgave Mom, understanding that she'd ultimately done the right thing by exposing the fraud. Others couldn't see past the false hope they'd been sold, the resources they'd wasted, the precious time lost believing in fake cures. I didn't blame them for their anger. Emma's family was among those who struggled to forgive. Her grandfather had spent his final months suffering through fake treatments instead of making peace with his diagnosis, pursuing false hope instead of saying proper goodbyes. She stole his death from him, Emma told me at the trial. She made his ending about her profit instead of his dignity, but there were others, like Mr. Martinez's daughter, who felt differently. "At least now I know the truth," she said. "At least other families won't go through what we did." She'd used her portion of the restitution fund to start a foundation providing real support for families facing terminal diagnoses, counseling, financial assistance, and honest information about treatment options. As for me, I left my marketing job and went back to school for investigative journalism. Mom's case had shown me how much suffering could be prevented by bringing hidden truths to light. I specialized in medical fraud, working with prosecutors to expose similar schemes before they could claim more victims. Mom and I talk every Sunday, just like we used to, though now our conversations happen across a prison visiting room table. She's changed during her incarceration, becoming someone who faces her mistakes honestly rather than hiding behind justifications. "I thought I was helping," she told me recently. "But I was just making myself feel better about taking money from desperate people." The day she's released, we'll have dinner together at the house on Maplecrest Drive, which I've kept exactly as it was, but everything will be different between us. Trust, once broken, requires careful rebuilding, and some cracks never fully heal. A week ago, I received a call from Agent Chen. "There's something else," she said, her voice carrying the same serious tone I remembered from that first conversation. "We've been investigating your father's car accident from 12 years ago, the one that left you and your mother alone." She paused. "There are connections to Cross's operation that we're just now understanding, connections that suggest your mother's involvement in medical fraud might have started much earlier than anyone realized." The investigation into Dad's death was reopening, and I was about to discover that the woman I thought I'd finally understood was still keeping secrets that could destroy everything we'd rebuilt between us. Some truths, it seems, have layers that go deeper than anyone imagines, and some stories never really end. They just reveal new chapters when you think you've reached the conclusion. 3 weeks after Agent Chen's call about Dad's accident, I finally worked up the courage to visit the storage unit Mom had been renting under a false name for the past decade. The key Mrs. Chen had given me at the funeral, the one that had seemed so mysterious at the time, fit perfectly into the lock of Unit 247 at Westside Storage. Inside, I found boxes of documents dating back to my childhood, medical records that painted a very different picture of Dad's final weeks, and financial statements showing payments from Cross Medical Consulting that predated Mom's supposed involvement by 5 years. My father hadn't died in a random car accident. He'd been a whistleblower, trying to expose the very fraud network that Mom would later join. The most devastating discovery was a letter in Dad's handwriting, addressed to me but never sent. "If something happens to me, know that your mother is in danger too. I tried to protect our family by walking away, but some secrets are too big to hide from forever." As I drove home with the evidence, I realized that everything I thought I understood about my family was built on another layer of lies. Mom hadn't become a criminal after Dad's death. She'd become one to survive it, pulled into Cross's network through grief, fear, and the desperate need to protect the only family she had left. The woman waiting in our living room that day after her funeral hadn't just been hiding from justice. She'd been hiding from a truth that went back to my childhood, to the moment our family first collided with forces beyond our control. The resurrection I'd witnessed was just the latest chapter in a story that began long before I was old enough to understand the cost of keeping dangerous secrets. Tomorrow, I would call Agent Chen and turn over Dad's files. But tonight, I would sit in Mom's empty house and finally understand why she'd spent 12 years teaching me to be strong enough to survive the truth she'd never been able to tell me. Some mothers protect their children with bedtime stories and warm milk. Mine had protected me with lies that kept me alive long enough to fight for justice she couldn't seek herself. The phone on the coffee table began to ring, displaying a number I didn't recognize. This time, I knew exactly what choice I would make.